Hello, I am Jaime Elizondo from Real World Ranching, where my goal is to help ranchers improve their land as fast as possible while maximizing their profitability. Today, I am going to talk to you about a myth that I hear frequently, that high harvest efficiency or high grazing efficiency will damage your soil. Where does this idea come from? I think it comes from an experiment done by a Professor Kreider over 70 years ago, where he demonstrated that under continuous grazing, you shouldn't graze more than half of the plant so that its roots will not shorten and disappear from the pasture. And I say that I think it comes from there, from that study, because all those who keep repeating this quoted in their bibliography. Unfortunately, people take it as a fact. And although now we have electric fences and we can imitate nature, taking into account the basic needs of the plant by knowing its physiology in depth, nothing has changed in these 70 years, and it continues to be repeated and referred to that experiment that no longer has significance in the modern world. Today, I am going to show you how high harvest efficiency or infrequent grazing as close as possible is the best way to manage your pastures to achieve the highest profitability and the fastest improvement of your soils and pastures. I ask you that if you know someone who could benefit from listening to this message, please send it to them, as it can help them a great deal to achieve harmony between their pasture, their cattle, and their economic needs. If you are one of my total grazing students, you know by doing it yourself that the total grazing program that includes the efficient harvest of grass when grazing it is how the grasses respond better to grazing as long as the indications detailed in the line course are followed. First, we must know that in the total grazing program, we seek as a priority to create deep and fat roots in our desirable species. Very different from the image of bare ground after a total grazing, right? Well, you should also take into account that by doing total grazing, the number of cows per day harvested is much higher than if they only consume 30%. This is what allows us to give a longer rest period and avoid overgrazing, which is regrazing a plant before it has fully recovered. We must also know how humus is formed, as humus is the true fertility of our soils. And it is formed thanks to the exudates of the roots that feed the soil microorganisms that in turn are converted themselves into humus. Up to 80% of the new humus is produced or formed this way. Of all the energy produced, as all the energy produced is by photosynthesis, we know the importance of the amount of green leaves we produce per square yard. We must also know that the stems do not photosynthesize, but they do consume energy by respiring, so that the ratio of leaves to stem into regrowth is so important. And so what type of grazing do you think will produce more leaves in the regrowth? A selective grazing where they leave the stems behind, or a total grazing where your cattle consume leaves and stems in its entirety? Well, also ask yourself, what regrows after you mow your lawn? Leaves or stems? Of course it's leaves. And that's why we mow it short, because we want a leafy lawn. So it is clear that when the stems are removed, the regrowth will be higher in leaves than if the stems are left behind, consuming part of the energy produced by the leaves that are regrowing. And if, as we saw before, that energy that is left after respiring is partially returned to feed the microorganisms that not only are eventually converted themselves into humus, but also make available to the host plant the nutrients in the soil that would otherwise be unavailable. Could it be that is the reason that the leaf to stem ratio is so important? You bet. We also have to consider that our cattle are going to perform better consuming more leaf. So again, we find another reason to do total grazing instead of selective rotational grazing. Now I want to tell you that it is important to defer pastures in area for the dry or cold season, and by grazing with a high harvest efficiency, this is possible and will be higher quality, the stockpile, than if stockpile under selective rotational grazing. Why? Because the deferred grass will not have been grazed since it was allowed to rest, and its quality, therefore, is much higher. In addition, the energy reserves in the roots are intact because they have not had to be used in new regrowth in the difficult season. This means that the regrowth after total grazing of a deferred field will be more vigorous once the rains return. And this has allowed me to maintain a very high stocking rate without incurring in overgrazing, even in years of hard drought or strong drought, where it only rained for 2 weeks through the year and at the end of the growing season. Under total grazing with high harvest efficiency, the land is not left bare because 80 to 90% of the available forage is consumed. Yes, but remember, production is much higher pre-grazing due to the longer rest periods we allow. So the litter left after grazing is sufficient to protect the land of the sun and high temperatures. Strong living roots of desirable plants close together are much more important than leaving a lot of residual or litter for erosion control and soil improvement. And I'm sure you have observed this. Strong roots hold the soil in place while litter is washed away or blown away. Conclusion and summary. Number one, the idea of leaving 50% of the plant as residual after grazing comes from an experiment done 70 years ago or so, when there were no electric fences but only barbed wire. That idea is already obsolete with current knowledge, and we do not need to continue to be bound to it. Two, under the total grazing program, we seek as a priority to create deep and fat roots in our desirable species. Three, grazing with a high harvest efficiency allows to increase the stocking rate while improving the leaf-to-stem ratio in the regrowth. Four, the leaf-to-stem ratio in the plant determines productivity, since the green leaves produce energy by photosynthesis while the stems consume energy by respiring. The energy left after respiring is what can be used for higher productivity and to form more humus with the bodies of soil microorganisms fed by the high energy exudates of the roots. No other type of grazing achieves a better leaf-to-stem ratio in the regrowth than a high harvest efficiency grazing or total grazing. 5, your livestock perform better consuming more leaves because the leaf has greater digestibility than the stems. So it is also convenient for our livestock to produce more leaves per square yard. 6, this high efficiency harvest allows us to defer in area entire fields to use them under total grazing in the difficult, dry, or cold season. 7, after total grazing with a high harvest efficiency, the land is not left bare because the 10 to 20% that remains on the ground is enough to prevent it from being exposed. Remember, since the field is left to rest for a longer time between grazings, thanks to the greater quantity of leaves, the production per acre is greater and the residue that remains after grazing is more than sufficient. 8, and the most important thing, and that almost nobody takes into account, the strong roots of desirable living plants that are close together that the total grazing program produces are much more efficient in preventing erosion than the amount of residue left by a selective grazing. Well, that's all for today. Thanks for listening, and see you next week. Until then, be sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or YouTube, or join us for the weekly email at www.rwranching.com/join. See you soon.